Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will begin our discussion on Sabrina and Corina, Fajardo-Anstine's debut short story collection. Last episode, we concluded our discussion on Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebai. Today, we will give a short overview of the collection and the major themes in Sabrina and Corina. We're so excited to discuss this collection since we met Fajardo-Anstine in Austin during the Texas Book Festival.
We're really looking forward to talk about this collection with you all, and welcome to everyone who's been listening, who's from all over the world, as we've seen. This is a National Book Award finalist, and it's a collection that has a lot of things to say about not just where it is set, in Colorado, but the way that women are treated, the way that women suffer, and also the other things, right, that we'll get into, like storytelling and some of the other themes. You had mentioned, Vanessa, that that we ran into Gali at the Texas Book Festival. And what is it, what do you think so far about, like, for readers to know about this book that would be good for them to know if this is their first time reading a story like this one?
I think that this collection as a whole is telling a really important story. One that isn't really seen a lot, which is why Fajardo-Anstine decided to write it. It's told from people that are just like her, Latinas of indigenous ancestry, I guess. And she made it to be able to see herself on the pages, and I think that's something that needs to happen more.
Yeah, right from the very first story, and there's 11 total, right? But from the very first one, Sugar Babies, we were talking earlier, right, before the recording, that you were saying it kind of sets the tone, right, for the whole collection.
Yeah, a little bit. Some of that imagery really kind of sets up. I think that in storytelling, especially I think in indigenous cultures, such a huge part of that is the land and landscape. And I think overall this book talks about the changing Denver and area and the generations of her family having seen that change. But early on from the first story, right, there's this imagery of this Mother Earth, or Earth as a sleeping woman, and these kids playing army. Now I know we're just kind of diving into themes right now, but
yeah,
I think that kind of sets up later on, like all these kind of instances in which women come to trauma through hungry men, as I think they're described throughout, violence and so on. So there's a lot to dig into here. No pun intended.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that struck me from this collection, before we dive into the specific stories in the next episode, is just how you were saying the characters suffer different kinds of trauma, whether it's through drug use, whether it's through losing a parent or a grandparent, or something just incredibly dark happens to, like, practically all these families, right, in some way. And so there's loss, and it reminded me a lot of course, our previous book, in December, also Patron Saints, but I was thinking also of Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, because Kentucky Club is about loss, is about from the very first story, about a woman who dies and is left to die in the desert, and the son also ends up dying in the same way.
Yeah. There's also instances of seeing family members go down a path that they can't necessarily be rescued from, and
Mm-hmm.
how helpless that seems, and that kind of reverberates in the last two books. You know, both
Yeah,
Patron Saints and Everything Begins at the Kentucky Club.
that is true.
Yeah.
What else did you find as a theme, Vanessa, from um, that either connected to any of the our previous works or just something you haven't seen before?
Well, this one connects back to pretty much everything we've read, I think. And it's about love and relationships and the different kinds of love, different kinds of relationships.
Could you explain that? What what it, what are the kinds of love that you see without diving into the specific stories yet, but like in general?
I think unconditional love is one of them.
Mm.
I'm going to just say the story because
Yeah,
sugar babies.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I think the parents, it's a little bit of unconditional. She has all her freedom. Um, I think the love between
Sisters.
sisters, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, or cousins,
Cousins
even.
that are like sisters.
Cousins that are like sisters, yeah.
Yeah.
What's another type of love?
The love between a parent and child, you know,
Yeah.
too, and vice versa, you know.
Or
And
maybe not even love, just the relationship between the parent and the child.
that's true. Um, and the you said it reminded you of like, was there something specifically it reminded you of, like a specific story from outside the collection?
Oh, Stuck in Love.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
To
Yeah.
the listeners who haven't heard of that, what is that?
It's my favorite movie. It has Liana Liberato, Nat Wolf, what's her name? Oh my goodness.
Oh.
Well, what's the premise of that movie?
So it's writers.
Whole
Essentially.
family of
A
writers.
family of writers is my favorite way to describe it. But the daughter in the movie, her name is it Sam?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is it Sam?
It's Sam.
Her relationship reminded me a lot of like this book. Just because of there's one scene in a restaurant and the boyfriend kind of asks her, "Is this how you feel about love?" after she just published her first book.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of made me a little bit curious on Kali's beliefs on love, I guess,
Yeah.
or where she stands.
And yeah, I mean, obviously, well, with that movie, and I know we're both going to present on it at a Papagayo, but
Mm-hmm.
I like that it kind of gives you a kind of a lens into different types, or love at different stages of people's lives, when it's like young and maybe a little naive, but hopeful, optimistic, and you get the cynical kind of love, and then you get the, you know,
Do
the
you get
rubber band slingshot kind of love,
Mm.
where it gets stretched out and
do you
snaps
get
back.
tough love like in Rule Maker?
Mm,
Like
not,
apparently.
Not
not
really.
necessarily,
No.
no. This maybe focuses more on romantic kind of love, and a little bit though. The familial kind of love is one of support,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because I know one of the reasons why the kids in the family are writers is because the dad's a big novelist, and he had them write journals, keep journals, and that attributed a lot to. Anyway, I know maybe we're straying away here from here, but you know, love is such a human thing, and it reminds me of when we had Ben on the podcast, Ben Signs, and
Mm-hmm.
when he talked about writing his collection of short stories, he was just telling stories of what he knows of the border and who he is, and I think that this is very much true of Kylie here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, writing stories of women that she most likely knows and
Yeah.
is and has been, and you can definitely see that manifest in the stories.
Yeah, we were listening to some of the interviews, and we got to talk to her a little bit in Austin at the Texas Book Festival about how she interviewed a lot of people in her town and in Colorado, and you know, you really do, someone who's only been there once, and you really do like feel the power of the land, and so it's kind of like for us here in the border, I think everything begins, with Ben does an amazing job of just showing the power of the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the same sense with Gali's work in this one.
Yeah.
You had already mentioned the landscape, the power of the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
They become huge aspects. And some of the in grad school, I took some classes where we focused a lot on indigenous and Native American literature,
mhm,
and that's such a huge aspect is storytelling. So much so that it said that we're nothing without our stories. These
mhm,
stories tell us where we come from. We get every culture has an origin story, right, of some sort. That often features the landscape, where we've been, and also there's personal histories as well of families. People tell stories of their great grandparents or things that they've done, and both good and bad, and we pass those on. And of course, as we live our lives, we always see ourselves as the protagonists of our own story. So storytelling is such a crucial component
mhm.
to what we're working with here.
And whether it's those stories of the past, that are already there,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's about rewriting those stories, reshaping them, and this kind of reminds me of Patron Saints,
Yeah.
because of course with Yoon,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that was very important for the second half of that novel. And so that kind of reminds me of, I'll just mention it briefly, but Domi, the story of Domi, and a story of someone who was in prison, and, Cole, and it's kind of this, a story of like, well, how to, first of all, the system itself of, the prison industrial complex is highly problematic. But outside of that, it's about how people are seen once they get out of prison, and so a lot of times, they get stigmatized in different ways. They lose rights, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But even when it comes to family, how is it that people can reconnect with each other? And so I think it's about, sometimes it is to many degrees, as what you mentioned about remembering your ancestors, and honoring their past. But I think it's also moving forward, finding a way to look ahead,
Mm-hmm.
shape your new story, and turn the page, is something that I saw in the
Right on.
connection as another theme. What else, Vanessa, did you?
I think history. I mean, not history. Dang, honesty.
Mm,
Honesty plays a really big, important role in a lot of these stories, and I guess more so the absence of honesty.
mm-hmm.
Um,
What kinds of lies did you see? Like, did you see what? Would you say white lies, or like outright deception, or why would people
I
lie?
I think a lot of the times they were lying to protect their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like lies of omission, or I guess, yeah, white lies as well.
Mm-hmm. There's something about, going back to the first story, right? Again, uncovering digging up the past,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Digging
Yeah.
up, that those bones
Yeah.
of your ancestors, and whether someone is able to um, live with that once you do so, right? It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like that genie in the bottle idea, or the Pandora's box.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
um, I think, I identity is something that we've talked about a lot, and so I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this also is about, what does it mean to be a woman, and there's strong women in these stories, and
Mm-hmm.
I think we need more of them.
Good
uh,
thing you paused.
yeah. So, very much in the mold of, or in the vein that you don't need male characters to drive your stories. You don't need
Mm-hmm.
a woman,
Mm.
these kinds of stereotypes of like the woman in distress who needs to be saved by a man, the husband, or the knight in shining armor idea, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Mhm.
ancient fairy tales. So I really like that about this collection because it really is empowering for women and their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And, she mentions in interviews like the Chicana in her that she herself is writing about in this collection and how we see different kinds of women. They're not all,
Mm-hmm.
the same, of course, but they're very similar in how the different kinds of power that they wield amongst women themselves and also amongst the men, in the relationships that they have in some cases,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's with family, the men in the family, or whether it's with their partners. So that
Yeah.
was something else to me.
Yeah, definitely. I noted a lot of the gender roles being
Mm.
kind of turned on their heads or looked upon differently, and also the way in which they're perpetuated, in various
Mm-hmm.
instances throughout the stories.
Mm.
Obviously, it's good to have that representation, and again, I like the first story
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that it kind of even sets up these dynamics where, you know, they're asked to couple up to take care of these babies early on, and
Mm-hmm.
but like they ask, well, why can't I take care of it on my own?
Yeah.
We'll dive into that more next episode, or
Yeah.
but I noticed that as well. A lot, just how like and everything begins in the Kentucky Club, ends the Kentucky Club. Ben questions what it means to be a man.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of instances come up of what does it mean to be a woman
Mm.
come up in these
Yeah.
stories,
And,
like both by society standards and just by
and the
their own.
Their own,
family. And it kind of it's in that sense, a lot of them have matriarchal, like the grandmother, or
Mm.
the
Mhm.
the abuela that is seen as this, the kind of, leader of the family, right? And in some cases, I think it's even problematizing that, because normally we think of course, matriarchy as something, good for society, but I think even Kali is kind of stretching that into thinking about, well, could even that be toxic? Are there
Mm-hmm.
ways where if it's set up in such a way that that could be toxic? And I think, going back to that first story you mentioned, right, that sets a tone, sugar babies, that, you, it's about, well, why is it that women have to raise kids, right?
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
The sugar baby.
Yeah.
I don't know about you guys, but I remember doing that in high school. Like we had to carry a doll around.
It's interesting. I
um,
never had to.
no,
Yeah.
I didn't, but my sister did.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think
She
it's
struggled a little bit, I
yeah,
think.
it's a good exercise. I think for interrogating those gender roles that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else, Vanessa?
I think we talked about every. I mean, I definitely think that all of these themes tie in to one another.
Mm.
Mm.
Like the histories, the ancestries,
Mm-hmm.
the different generations ties into like the different relationships that we see and the different types of love that we see. Um, and then that also ties into the honesty and why people lie to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then also the storytelling goes back to the ancestry. I think they all
Hmm.
tie into one another.
Yeah, I think so too.
Oh, what a complex web we weave. Huh?
um, and just the cover itself. I mean, it's just one of the most beautiful covers I've
Yeah.
seen.
The colors are so bright.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to ask her. If we ever have a chance to talk to her.
Yeah.
How she, I'm always interested how authors collaborate with the artists on their book covers.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the jacket.
Because we mentioned that with June as well, and
Oh
not
yeah.
June, but like in Rube's
Oh,
book as
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
That's very eye catching
Yeah.
Yeah.
cover. But this is so a beautiful, super beautiful cover.
Yeah.
And the artist, I think they're on the jacket cover, the back jacket cover. Definitely like on the inner.
Yes.
Yeah. Gustavo Rimada.
Yeah, so shout out
And
to
for the illustration and then the design is Sharanya Vasula.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, any other connections you guys can think besides everything begins in patron saints, like
Mm.
Report X or um, other works outside of the ones we
Yeah.
talked about.
Right.
You guys have mentioned Second Love as a film.
Well, you had
Um,
mentioned Woman Hollering Creek.
oh yeah,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So Women Haunting Creek is uh, to me a very important story because collection because how it we talked about the past, right, and history and dealing with it, but I think the beauty of Women Haunting Creek is being able to reshape this archetype of La Llorona into an empowering positive archetype, and not one that has been demonized. So I really love that collection because of it. I also love that collection because of how strong the women are in it. And there's, a story there about dolls, and kind of how dolls themselves, hold this power. And so as I was reading Sugar Babies, that reminded me a lot of this one.
Mm.
So if you all haven't, I mean, it's a classic, so it's a classic Chicana collection. Um, but yeah, that one was the one that stood out to me as far as other stories.
Yeah. Well, I guess another thing I'm thinking about right now that maybe would be interesting is I didn't get to meet her, but you guys did. One thing that I think you mentioned is meeting her. You wouldn't expect this collection to be so dark,
Mm.
right? I know. I think when you were reading this, you had mentioned it
Mm-hmm.
about how you know you wouldn't expect like talking to her. She's very lively
Mm-hmm.
and animated, and then you
Mm-hmm.
read this, and there's that contrast. What'd you make of that?
Yeah, what did you make of that, Vanessa? Um,
I was definitely not expecting it, but I feel like writers typically write the things that they don't know how to express, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like she writes it down and lets it out that way, and then it's kind of like the weight is off her shoulders, and so she has this ability to be more lively, I guess.
yeah, I mean that is interesting. Kind of similar to when we interviewed Ben Sines, that his story collection is incredibly dark too, and very similar. We had already mentioned, and you know, to both Vanessa and I, Gali was incredibly kind and jovial and,
Mm-hmm.
so inviting. Like, we had never met her before.
Yeah,
We hadn't even talked to her before in any other medium.
that's awesome.
So, you know, she, from the very beginning, she was very interested in what we do and learning about this podcast that we were just starting at the time,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I think it's about, there's some things that, some demons that you exercise when you write, and it goes back to what you were mentioning, Richie, about storytelling and how it's kind of the breath that you let out that sometimes I think you don't, in those kinds of interactions with readers and, book festivals and conferences and things like that. So I think it really speaks to Gadi's ability to be able to do that and still, because it's like any kind of power, that it can have a power over you that I think,
Mm-hmm.
could make you this kind of, someone who is depressed and someone who is, standoffish, or someone like Cormac McCarthy, who famously, like,
He's a little
not
reclusive.
reclusive, um, and doesn't sign books either, but, but, um, I think obviously, like, writers have their personalities, but I think it is quite a striking contrast, and I mean, should we be so lucky to interview her? That would be something that I would like to hear more about.
Yeah, yeah, because yeah, you kind of mentioned that during reading it that how you had experienced it, and
Mm-hmm.
I like both your answers on that. Really to write down to share that perspective, that oftentimes introspective perspective that we're not so willing to put out there, but it allows us to deal with, but also connect. Ultimately that's it. That very human thing of connecting through our thoughts, through our words, and our art.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, Callie's put together this very beautiful collection that speaks to a lot of those aspects of our humanity that we can all connect with
Yeah.
in various ways.
Yeah. And also, just reading it just makes me want to go to Colorado and,
Absolutely.
Saguarito and, yeah. Sorry. Um,
Yeah, no, I
yeah.
definitely want to make a trip up there.
Yeah. Anything else, Vince?
Um, not really.
Well, at the
How much longer do we have? Like, how much?
I mean, we don't really have a time limit.
Okay.
well,
for it.
one other thing that I forgot to mention is so at the book festival we didn't just meet her, but we also went to a couple of her panels, right?
Yes.
So she was in a panel um, with women, right?
Mhm.
And it was the offer of my time amongst the whites, which is I think another very important book. Janine Crusette and a friend of hers. I can't remember the writer. But,
Ivalis
thank you,
Rodriguez.
thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. So it was a panel of Latina writers. And Kali mentioned, I guess, how when she got this one published, she got a 2-book deal. So I think that's really exciting because that means there's another one coming. I think the next one's going to be a novel.
Mhm.
So I'm really excited. I liked hearing about, so Ivalis and Kali are kind of like best friends. And I liked hearing about the story about how they met, which was like at a writer's like workshop. And I can't remember who spoke to who first, but they like followed the other one into like the parking lot, I guess. And they sat and talked under a tree for like hours. And it was like they were like they had already known each other for so long. Like they sat there for hours.
Yeah.
And I like the relationship of them because they still work to help each other promote each other's work.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the main themes of this panel, I think, was that women should be helping women,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to like getting published. Like we should support each other in doing that.
Yeah. And talking to her, right? I mean, it's something in person that you really do feel, like you're being listened to, and I think it speaks to Kali's empathy
Mhm.
and her genuine curiosity, and just listening to these stories. And I can tell then, what she had said in the interview that, she interviewed a lot of women, a lot of
A lot of research went
yeah, a
into
lot of
it.
research. So it's not surprising then, to find that these stories, the very similitude to like, you know, these are everyday things, that sometimes get swept under the rug, and but that putting them all together into a cohesive whole, I think um, is something to think about in terms of what each story is doing ultimately.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive a little deeper into these stories and
This is kind of just the intro,
yeah.
to this collection because there's a lot to talk about. We have 11 stories that we're gonna get through, so we're gonna split those up in half. Vanessa, did you have anything to say to the readers, like as far as what's coming then for episode 2?
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode for our first discussion on Sabrina and Corina by Fajardo-Anstine. Join us next week when we'll continue this discussion. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at UPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.